I'm going to wrap up the urinary system by looking at 4 tables from your book and reviewing the most important information from these tables. This first table talks about what substances, and when we say substances, those are either going to be water or solutes found in your blood. So, what substances are filtered out of your blood, and that occurs at the glomerular capsule. What substances are reabsorbed back into the bloodstream, and that happens along the tubule and peritubular capillaries. And then finally, what is secreted. And then ultimately, what you get is urine. So the first column are all the molecules that are filtered from blood per day. 180 liters of water per day. Little bit of proteins, those would include smaller proteins, but you'll notice that we're going to reabsorb most of those proteins back into the bloodstream. Some solutes, including all those small little ions that get filtered out, sodium, chloride, bicarbonate. Glucose is fairly small, so a lot of it gets filtered out, but you'll notice that we're going to reabsorb 100% of it. Urea, potassium, uric acid, and creatinine are metabolic waste products that get filtered out. Looking at what's reabsorbed, most of that water, so 99% of that water is reabsorbed back in, and that leaves 1 to 2 liters of urine per day. Most of the protein gets reabsorbed, so very little is going to be found in urine. Most of the other solutes like sodium and chloride and bicarbonate are reabsorbed. All of the glucose, quite a bit of the urea is reabsorbed. It's a little counterintuitive because urea is a waste product, but it is reabsorbed to keep that kidney with a high osmolarity. So urea is interesting in that quite a bit of it gets filtered, some of it gets reabsorbed, a lot of it gets secreted, so you still end up with a lot of it in urine. Potassium, a lot of potassium is reabsorbed. Unless you have a high dietary potassium, then we will secrete some potassium. A little bit of uric acid is reabsorbed, but we get rid of enough. And creatinine doesn't get reabsorbed, so we can eliminate that metabolic waste. So basically what you have here in this last column is what is in urine after you have filtered, reabsorbed, and secreted. This table is a table of hormones. So these are the 5 hormones that target kidneys. I'll remind you that the kidney also produces 2 hormones, erythropoietin or EPO, and it also produces calcitriol or vitamin D. Looking at this table, there's quite a bit of information, but typically when it comes to a hormone, you might want to remember what stimulates its production, and then what does that hormone do? So what are the effects on the kidney? Occasionally we want to point out a mechanism, but mostly you want to think, what's the stimulus? What causes the body to produce the hormone? And then what is it going to do to the kidney? Angiotensin 2 is triggered to be secreted by a low blood volume and low blood pressure. And remember, this angiotensin 2 is a product of that renin, aldosterone, angiotensin pathway. So if you have a low volume or low pressure, what would this hormone do to help? Well, it's going to reabsorb sodium, it's going to reabsorb some water, and it's going to decrease blood volume by increasing GFR. So this table doesn't mention that, but we mentioned that previously. Angiotensin 2 is going to decrease filtration rate. And that should help the problem, which is low blood volume. Aldosterone is related to angiotensin 2 in that they're both usually produced together. Aldosterone is going to also reabsorb sodium, chloride, and therefore water. What makes it a little different is that it is not a vasoconstrictor, so it doesn't affect GFR, but it does secrete potassium. So aldosterone will be produced if you have high potassium in an effort to help get rid of some of that potassium. Antidiuretic hormone, that's one that we've heard of numerous times, so you should know this one like the back of your hand. This one is stimulated by a high osmolarity. Basically, high osmolarity means you're dehydrated. When there's a high osmolarity, that's typically because there's a low water. So you have low water, high osmolarity. That is monitored at the hypothalamus, because the hypothalamus produces ADH. Then it is stored and released by the posterior pituitary. This is the one where the mechanism we did talk about. It's the aquaporin 2 channels that get inserted into the principal cells of the collecting ducts. And that aquaporin 2 will help reabsorption of water. Reabsorbing water will hopefully lower that osmolarity. Atrial natriuretic peptide, that's the one that's kind of different than the other three in that it's usually produced, or it is produced, when there's a high volume. A high blood volume stretches the atria. The atria of the heart produces ANP to help excrete sodium. And if you excrete sodium, you can get rid of more water. So this is basically the opposite of the previous three, where the other three were more reabsorbing salt and water, keeping salt and water in the body, whereas ANP helps you get rid of salt, sodium, and get rid of water. So it's kind of your body's natural diuretic. And then parathyroid hormone doesn't really have much to do with water or sodium or chloride. It has everything to do with calcium. Produced by your parathyroid glands, targets the distal convoluted tubule to increase reabsorption of calcium. Next table is what your urine should look like, or what are the characteristics of normal urine. We know the volume should be somewhere between 1 to 2 liters a day. You've probably seen the color, anywhere from a yellow or amber. If it's very dilute, it'll be almost clear. If it's concentrated, it'll be really dark, kind of that dark amber color. So the color varies based on concentration. There are other things that might influence the color of urine that you should be aware of. One is diet. So there's a number of things in your diet that might influence the color of urine. One kind of classic one is beets. You probably don't eat beets every day, but occasionally if you throw some beets in your salad, you should be aware that your urine might look a little pink. A lot of times people might confuse that with blood. Certain medications influence urine color. That's an important one. Sometimes if you're doing a urinalysis, you need to know what medication someone is taking, because those medicines might influence the results of a urinalysis. And then finally, any blood in the urine obviously would influence color, and that blood needs to be investigated. Where that blood coming from? Turbidity is how transparent urine is. It's very transparent. When it's freshly voided, it becomes turbid. So turbid actually means cloudiness if it's been sitting around. Odor should vary a little bit, maybe based on diet. There's a molecule in asparagus that actually will be metabolized different ways by different people, and certain people will have an odor in their urine after they've eaten asparagus. Urine will become more ammonia-like if it sits around. Basically, if urine sits around, bacteria convert the urea back into ammonia, and you get this ammonia odor. Occasionally, diabetics with poorly managed diabetes can have a fruity odor to their urine. This is due to these waste products called ketones. Ketones are metabolic byproducts of fat metabolism. So if your body is burning a lot of fat, a lot of fatty acids, it produces these ketones. It sounds great to burn a lot of fat, but the body shouldn't burn a lot of fat. It needs to get the correct amount of energy from glucose, from amino acids, and from fat. But if the body isn't getting enough glucose for energy, like in diabetics, it'll burn fatty acids. pH, here's the normal range, 4.6 to 8, with an average around 6. So that's the number to remember, 6. Plus or minus, 2 is the normal pH of urine. Diet does affect that as well. High protein diets can increase the acidity, so the pH might go down. Vegetarian diets, the pH might be a little bit higher than normal. And finally, specific gravity is a more objective measure of concentration. So notice concentration, we often just look at color, but color isn't very measurable. It's a little more subjective. So to get a good measure of concentration, they do what's called a specific gravity or density test. And it's compared to water. So water is given a number 1, 1.0000. That's water. Anything that's in water will make it more dense, will increase the specific gravity. So we compare urine to water. And the normal specific gravity of urine should be somewhere in this range, 1.001 to 1.035. Anything higher than this number means it's concentrated. The person might be dehydrated. It'll never be below this, because if you get below this, you're almost pure water. But that would be very dilute urine if it's down to towards this number. Okay, so that's kind of normal urine. This last table is a little overwhelming, a lot of information, but these are some things you shouldn't see in urine. And some of these I want you to make sure you do understand. Like albumin. Why should albumin not be in urine? One is it's a protein, and urine shouldn't have a whole lot of protein in it. It's actually a fairly small or a fairly large protein, so it shouldn't be filtered out at all. So it's too large to pass through the fenestrations. Therefore, if they find albumin in urine, that's a red flag. It could mean that there is some sort of problem at the kidney. So the permeability of the glomerulus is too high, maybe due to an injury or disease or inflammation. Very high blood pressure could cause that albumin to be kind of pushed out of the glomerulus. And then there's some other things like toxins, heavy metals that might cause this. So albumin shouldn't be in urine because it's too big, doesn't get filtered. Glucose shouldn't be in urine, but for a different reason. It does get filtered, but it should get completely reabsorbed back into the blood. There are cases where glucose can be found in urine, usually poorly managed diabetes. Other things could excessive epinephrine secretion, where that boosts the blood sugar really, really high. So anything that causes high blood sugar might result in glucose being in urine. Shouldn't be red blood cells in urine. That usually is indication of possibly a contamination. Maybe it's just menstruation, or kidney stones, or inflammation, or a urinary tract infection. Those are some causes of blood in the urine. Ketones we mentioned. Ketones are a result of little carbohydrate but high fatty acid utilization. So in diabetes, cells aren't getting glucose. It can't come in to the cells. So those cells are using fatty acids. And when the cells use fatty acids for energy, the result are these ketone bodies. The last couple things I want to mention, CAS, we don't hear too much about those. Those are little masses of material that form in the tubules. So these are very, very tiny little masses. Sometimes it's the cells that kind of clump up and cause these little CAS. But these are not kidney stones. Kidney stones are found first usually in that renal pelvis, and then sometimes they can be passed down the ureters and into the bladder. And then finally, shouldn't be microbes in urine. If there is, obviously treatment with maybe an antibiotic if it's a bacterium, or an antifungal if it's a yeast infection. But microbes should not be in urine. Typically, what they will do with urine is try to culture it, see if anything's growing in it, and then determine from those results if there is indeed a microbe, and then hopefully identify that microbe. So those are those last 4 tables. Hopefully that kind of gives you some clinical knowledge. For example, what normal urine should be, and then what abnormal urine might have